since this new U.S. coup effort has been failing right in front of our eyes. This is a big one because this is mainstream journalists on the ground in Venezuela that went there to do a documentary that are now openly and just in every possible way debunking the mainstream narrative of Venezuela. Now, this is for those that think that we're completely wrong about it. Oh, he's an evil dictator and everyone's starving and they're eating their own animals and all the ridiculous things that they've spread through mainstream media. If you believe this stuff, this is going to be a hard one for you to wrap your mind around because these are the very people that you would blindly trust, being mainstream media. Now, this is coming from Counterpunch, the original article. I prefer the title that was used by Zero Hedge that says, quote, Guaido is the most hated man in Venezuela. On the ground in Caracas versus the media spectacle, because that's a literal quote from these mainstream journalists on the ground, that Guaido is the most hated man in Venezuela. But shocking that you won't hear that from mainstream media. Again, because their job is not to inform you, it is to keep you uninformed. That is the reality of mainstream media. But again, the point, on the ground in Venezuela, by mainstream journalists doing a documentary, versus the media spectacle that you've been hearing and that many people have emotionally and aggressively been forcing because they know, because they talk to somebody on Twitter that lives in Venezuela. Well, yeah, that's a solid source, I'm sure, but the reality is people there, including mainstream, are now showing us that that is all utter BS. Now, British photojournalists, Ilan Jingwa, I believe I'm probably just mispronouncing the name, and Venezuelan journalist, filmmaker Carolina Graterol, it's very interesting names, Great Role. I apologize to both of them for mispronouncing their names. I actually tried to search for them. I couldn't find any way to pronounce them properly. But the reality is, British photojournalist, we'll say Alan, and Venezuelan journalist, filmmaker Carolina, both based in London, went to Venezuela for a month to shoot a documentary for a major global TV channel. Now, they talked with journalist Paul Cochran about the mainstream media's portrayal of Venezuela compared to their experiences on the ground. Now, as Alan said, we went in June 2018 for a month to shoot a documentary. I can't disclose what channels it will be on right now, but it should be airing soon. So we'll likely be able to see more of this coming directly from them as it airs. Now, they're asked, how did being in Venezuela compare to what you were seeing in the Western media? Now, again, I've shared you the direct clips, and all this is in there for you to see for yourself. They're direct answers. Carolina says, I'm a journalist. I have family in Venezuela, and I knew the reality was different from what the media is portraying. But I was surprised. The first thing we noticed was the lack of poverty. The lack of poverty. Straight from mainstream journalist's mouth. Alan wanted to film homeless and poor people on the streets. I saw 3 people sleeping rough just this morning in London, but in Venezuela, we can't find any. In big cities or towns. Now, how does that jive with what they've been trying to tell you? She goes on to say, we wanted to interview them, but we couldn't find them. It is because of multidisciplinary programs run by the government with social services working to get children off the streets. Sounds like something we could use in the United States or return to their families. The program has been going on for a long time, but I hadn't realized how effective it was. Things look worn down and tired. There is food. There are private restaurants, she says, and cafes open, and you could feel the economic crisis kicking in, but poverty is not as bad as what I've seen in, say, Brazil or Colombia, where there are lots of street children. Funny how the U.S. isn't wringing its hands over the groups that they're working with to try to overthrow Venezuela. Interesting how that works. It gets better. They asked the question, how have the U.S. sanctions impacted Venezuela? Well, of course, they say food is expensive, but people are buying things. The government has created a system, local communities for production and supply, known as the Spanish acronym CLAP, that feeds people. 6 million families every month via a box of food. This is coming from the journalists themselves. I mean, just right off the bat, it's it's right in your face how directly contradicting this is to the mainstream narrative. It says people were a good size, and nobody is dying from hunger or now malnutrition. Outright, nobody is dying from hunger or malnutrition. From mainstream journalists on the ground in Venezuela, they ask, so the crisis we read about every day is primarily due to U.S. sanctions? They ask. And they says the sanctions have affected the country. This economic war started waging internally and also externally, blocking international loans. Interesting, that's exactly what we've been saying, that they have effectively blocked them from being able to find their way out of a hole that the U.S. created for them. Goes on to say, so what are Venezuelans eating, they ask. Again, trying to dig at this, trying to pick the scab, this interviewer trying to find a way to make this look bad for Venezuela like they usually do. But they respond, the main complaint was that people couldn't eat meat like they used to. The situation is not that serious. I mean, come on, people. It's humorous to me that this, of course, for the people likely, and this is my assumption, that have been going along with the mainstream narrative this far will just disregard these people, even though if they came back with the opposite story, it would be heralded as truth on the ground. But mainstream journalists that come back and tell you the opposite, sort of like Alfred Isaias, the expert from the UN, did and said, no, this is the wrong thing. The sanctions are causing this. They just ignored him. But now we have mainstream journalists. The situation's not that serious on the ground. And he points out before Hugo Chavez came to power, Venezuela had 40% critical poverty. And that's, of course, when they were run by U.S. puppets, remember this, before them, out of 80% poverty. But that rate went down to 27%. Oh, terrible socialism here. Now, again, I shouldn't even say that because I'm not advocating for socialism, and I know people will take it that way. The reality is that's the ridiculous narrative that just because of this ideology, everything's so terrible. I think all government's bad, personally, socialism and democracy. But the reality is it's not just that. It's U.S. propaganda and their sanctions and their actions. But during the time when Chavez was ruling, it went down to 27. And before the crisis was just 6 or 7% critical poverty, which is massively bigger just over the border in Colombia. That country is in a massive critical poverty crisis. But because it's a U.S. ally, they just won't talk about it. It says everyone is receiving help from the government. Again, what a terrible dictator they are by helping all their people. It says also, mango trees are everywhere, so you can pick a mango whenever you want. Funny how that works out. They go on to say, the real attack on the economy is on food. When you have hyperinflation, everything goes up in price. But bills like water, electricity, public transport haven't gone up that much. This is why the distortions in the economy are not intrinsic, but caused by external factors. Otherwise, everything should have gone up. No matter what it is. What a logical, clear-minded point. If there was really a specific problem on their side, government mismanagement, managing the economy, everything would generally go up. But the point they're making is it's caused by specific external factors. And that's why water specifically and food are the problems. But everything else is generally the same because this is a targeted economic attack. Goes on to ask, what about the power cuts that have plagued the country? They respond, during blackouts, people told stories, played music, or went out and talked on the streets. It was a paradise, they say. No TVs, smartphones, but real human contact. What a stark contrast to the horrifying, nightmarish scene the mainstream media tries to sell you. Remember, these are mainstream journalists that were there, living there, conducting a documentary, meaning not just a day, but an ongoing investigation. They say people cook together. During the day, they are playing board games, dominoes, and kids are having fun. What a terrible blackout that sounds like. And it goes on to say people with kids are possibly more stressed, especially if you live in a tower block, as you've got no electricity. And remember, this is because of U.S. actions, and it says you've got no water. That is why the U.S. hit the electric grid, this mainstream journalist very clearly says, as it means no water in Caracas. Let me repeat that. That is why the U.S. hit the electricity grid. Good Lord. It says a city of 10 million people. Luckily, there are wells with clean water, which the U.S. wouldn't tell you around the city, so people queue up to get it. Hey, and everything seems fine. They asked the question, so there was a real discrepancy between the image you were given of Venezuela and the reality? Yeah, maybe this interviewee is not really paying attention to what they're saying. They respond by saying, sure, there are queues for oil, but people are not dying of starvation. Let me repeat that. People are not dying of starvation. And, as I said, poverty is nowhere near what it's like in Brazil. I wouldn't say a harsh dictatorship. People were open and criticizing the government and the U.S., but also Chavez and Maduro. See, this is something they've failed to recognize and reconcile in their ridiculous narrative, is why would a dictator allow massive rallies of anti-Maduro protests to go on within his own country? Oh, what an evil dictator. Why would he allow Guaido to wander around screaming about overthrowing the government? That's not the actions of a dictator. No one's trying to claim he's the best person alive. I don't trust any government official. But they're all equally as corrupt as far as I'm concerned, but the lies they're telling are on their face ridiculous. And he's very clearly saying that people were allowed to walk around and criticize him. He said there's no dictatorship here. He says people were not fearful about speaking out. I think Venezuelans blame the Americans for the situation more than Maduro. I mean, think about how fearful Americans are to speak out against the government here, for fear that the CIA is going to start tracking them. I mean, seems like people are more free there. People still do it here, but the reality is making clear that people are speaking out openly and with no fear of reprisal. Very stark contrast to what they want you to think there. They ask, what do you make of the hullabaloo in February about U.S. and Canadian aid being blocked by Venezuela? It's a good question because we've covered this a lot. They say, it is a Trojan horse. Flat out, first thing out of his mouth, it is a Trojan horse. A good way to get the U.S. in, and why international agencies were not willing to take part in the plan. Instead, there has been a Russian and Chinese aid coming in, and as well as Turkey and about 7 other countries I can think of off the top of my head, including the Red Cross, mind you. It's just funny because these people are clearly actually doing their research, and it's not even like a question about whether it's this way or that way. They're outright saying, no, that was a complete lie. The world has acknowledged that that's a politicized aid effort to overthrow the country because these people have done their research. I mean, it's just staggering to me. And here's the last one I want to cover. They say very clearly, there's not the chaos U.S. and Trump were expecting. Opposition leader and self-proclaimed President Juan Guaido is the most hated guy in Venezuela. These people are on the ground experiencing it there. And not the Eva Bartlett's and the Vanessa Beelys of the world that the mainstream circles think are absolute propagandists, even though the only people telling the truth. These are mainstream journalists that otherwise would be heralded as heroes if they had said the opposite. Really let that sink in. The most hated guy in Venezuela. He has to stay in luxury hotels in La Mercedes, I'm probably mispronouncing that, an expensive neighborhood of Caracas. They have electricity there as they were prepared, so bought generators. That is why Guaido went there and has a whole floor of luxury hotel for him and his family. While people are suffering, Guaido is trying on suits for his upcoming trip to Europe. It is a parallel world. I mean, I just really don't understand how people can still think what's happening on the ground in Venezuela, or rather what they're telling you is happening there, is the reality. We have roundly proven every single one of their claims to be verifiably false. We have independent journalists on the ground showing you regularly the lies. Now we have mainstream journalists. But just like with the BBC producer coming out about Syria, they're just going to pretend they didn't say anything. They're going to ignore it. So the average people only watching mainstream will never even hear about what this person has to say. That is how they control it. Just like we covered yesterday about the propaganda multiplier. They get told what to say, they dutifully repeat it. That's mainstream media. That's where it comes from. They trust me. They really want you to think they've got these secret inside sources that know everything that's going on. All you got to do is trust them. And that is an utter lie. I really hope this gets through to some people because this stuff is powerful. And I'm looking forward to the documentary that probably won't get aired.
Thanks everyone for coming.